Welcome, everyone. My name is Tristan Claridge, and I'm the Director of the Institute for Social Capital, and I'm also the current President of the International Social Capital Association. Today, I'll be giving a webinar about the practical application of social capital, and I'm focused on providing a general overview. I'm really delighted to present my work on this that I've been developing over at least the last 15 years or so. And because social capital is such a complex concept, it can be applied in practical applications in very different ways. So I'll be outlining a theoretically grounded and logical framework for the application of social capital that is flexible and that provides insights into the ways in which the concept can be deployed meaningfully in very different and diverse kinds of contexts. So by way of overview, of course, we need to start with what social capital actually is. So we're on the same page about that because there's a few different meanings and interpretations out there. I'll talk about the importance and value of social capital, which undoubtedly you all already know. But I think this is important because we need to be able to communicate this with stakeholders and decision makers. So the more we can talk about it and we can share ideas about how we can communicate that, the better. I'll then talk about the value of social capital for practical applications and where and how the concept can be applied within diverse different applications. I'll outline my approach for the application of social capital and how we can go about using that approach in various different types of practical applications. The aim here is to provide a general overview, and I'm sure you'll get a lot of different ideas about how we might be able to use the concept. So the core intuition of social capital is that relationships are valuable and can be an asset that enables positive and productive action. In a general sense, social capital is the ability, capacity, and potential for people to cooperate and work together and interact and exchange positively. In essence, the fundamental proposition of social capital is that relationships matter. As social capital is an important capital, we can invest in positive working relationships, we can create effective groups and organizations, and we can establish constructive and inclusive institutions. It relates to environments where people are inclined to cooperate, collaborate, and participate in collective action, and where people engage in pro-social action, where they are helpful, giving, and cooperative. And this represents a vital stock of future benefit. And this is why it is a form of capital and something that we need to be mindful and cognizant of. So there's many ideas out there about what it is, networks, or perhaps it's informal norms, or trust, or resources. And there's lots of ideas. And what we've found is that there's two core components of this. And this is illustrated by the following quote from Bob Putnam in his popular book, Bowling Alone. A society of many virtuous but isolated individuals is not necessarily rich in social capital. And we may be also able to understand this a different way. A very well-connected but a highly distrusting community is also not rich in social capital. So we can see then that people need to be connected. Without connectedness, there can be limited opportunities and abilities to act. It's hard to benefit from social relationships if you're isolated. And second, people need to be virtuous. Or a different way to think about this is they need to have predispositions to act positively. Perhaps you could think of this as inclinations, or you could think of it as behavioral intentions or motivations to act pro-socially. There's different ways of thinking about this, but this is that inclination to be virtuous, that's that potential. So when we analyze within the context of capital, that is what social capital actually does, we find that all the different ideas about social capital relate to one or possibly both of these core components. And certainly both are required for strong social capital. So the concept of social capital is not new. It became popular in the 1990s, but it's not a new idea. Social capital is similar to concepts you're probably very familiar with, concepts we use regularly like inclusion or cohesion. Perhaps has similarities to concepts like trust and solidarity. This means that social capital is not something new. It's not some new secret sauce, if you like. It's something that we use every day and is part of every group and organization. For example, every day we meet people and we form relationships. We build trust and goodwill, regardless of whether we're familiar with the concept of social capital or not. But social capital is a different way of thinking about the importance of social relationships, which really has been something that's always been fundamental to humans. From a historical point of view, humans could not have survived without what we now call social capital. The ability to work together, to cooperate for mutual benefit, was essential to survival, and it actually continues to be vital for the functioning of our society and our economy. So it's essential for individuals, as well as groups and society. And although we may not be fully aware of it, and we may not actually use the term social capital to describe it. Unfortunately, most people, projects, and organizations are not attentive to its value and importance. They may not prioritize its creation, and they may not appropriately make use of it, and they may actually accidentally damage it. The concept of social capital gives us a framework for considering the causes and context for cooperation and collective action, which allows us to be more purposeful in our consideration of them. This is not to say, of course, that we don't already build and use social capital in just about everything that we do, and there's many related concepts that perhaps touch on areas of the concept. It's often that we just miss opportunities and perhaps we accidentally damage it. So the widespread and rapid adoption of the term social capital suggests there's a significant unmet need to communicate something of importance. And I think the concept's popularity is testimony to that perceived usefulness. As Michael Woolcock said, social capital has such widespread resonance because it provides a name for that intuitive, transcultural recognition that we are inherently social beings, and that this has significant consequences for a host of other substantive issues that we care about. So I'll talk a little bit more about the importance of social capital. It's a vital resource for groups, individuals, and society. And it's been described as both a glue that holds societies together, without which collaboration and cooperation would not be possible, as well as a lubricant that facilitates getting things done. It allows people to work together and to access benefits from social relationships. And I'll touch on each of the benefits and importance for individuals, groups and organizations, and communities and societies separately. So for individuals, social capital is important because it is a significant source of benefit, support, power, and influence that helps people to get by and get ahead. The old adage, it's not just what you know, but who you know, relates to the powerful effects and importance of social capital. And it provides a range of benefits for individuals, including facilitating access to resources, supporting emotional and psychological well-being, and enhancing career opportunities and mobility, just to name a few of the key important outcomes for individuals. For groups and organizations, social capital is vital to their efficiency and even their existence. It enables people to work together, and it facilitates cooperation and innovation. It contributes towards positive workplace culture, and it enhances an organization's ability to navigate challenges, to attract talent, to build stronger relationships, both internally and with external stakeholders as well. So then it's vital for any team, any project, any activity, any group of people of any kind. Any organization that does not consider the importance of social capital is missing an opportunity for improvement and risking inefficiencies and perhaps even peril. Social capital is critical to mobilizing and activating human capital of members of the organization and providing access to the various forms of capital of connected individuals and organizations. And this capital may be human capital, physical, financial, and various other forms of capital that may be mobilized or accessed through those connections. For communities and societies, social capital is important because it allows societal institutions to exist, and it maintains the coherence of society. It facilitates the cooperation and collaboration of different groups and organizations, and it plays a crucial role in the well-being and development of communities and societies at large. Strong social capital allows people to work together to address common issues, implement positive changes, and achieve shared goals, leading to a more resilient and empowered community. Social capital is important for a range of other concerns, such as economic development, health and well-being, crime reduction, community resilience. There's many different applications of social capital at the community level. So as I mentioned, I think it's important to talk about these things because we need to be able to communicate the importance of social capital to both decision makers and stakeholders. And there's lots of ideas that I've just presented about how we might go about doing that at different levels. So social capital is clearly not a fad or a buzzword. There's been sustained growth and interest in social capital now for over 30 years across all of the social sciences and beyond outside of academia to applications in politics, where it's been used by various political parties around the world, as well as in economic development. For example, it was used extensively by the World Bank, also in business, public health, sustainability, disaster management, community development, and there's many, many other areas as well where it's been used extensively. And consideration of social capital provides substantial opportunities to improve outcomes anywhere people work together or where cooperation and positive social action is beneficial, which really, when you think about it, is just about every aspect of human endeavor. And social capital, I think, has two significant values for practical applications. First is that it communicates something that is often overlooked or undervalued in conventional analysis and reporting. It gives it a name and allows us to talk about it collectively and find solutions and approaches that can improve outcomes. It allows us to evaluate it, qualify it, and measure it. And it allows us to communicate it with its importance to decision makers and policymakers, having the potential to significantly improve outcomes. And the second main value for practical applications is that it provides a framework to understand the benefits and importance of social and cultural processes, and therefore tangible ways to improve practice and therefore outcomes. An understanding of social capital allows us to do the following. It allows us to do more of the strengths and to start doing the opportunities. It allows us to overcome limitations and weaknesses and break down challenges and barriers. It allows us to do less damage to social capital and to develop strategies to reduce the risk of loss. It allows us to change the nature of social capital to reduce the potential for negative downsides. Often, efforts to maximize or mitigate may only require simple, low-cost changes to existing activities, and the concept of social capital can illuminate these. So the concept in practical applications can be used for a wide variety of different purposes. Because it facilitates cooperation and collective action, it's valuable anywhere where people work together. This means it can be applied to any community, any group, organization, team, project, or activity. And the concept of social capital can be used to improve social capital in a general sense or for specific ends, for specific purposes. This means that individuals can build their social capital, including for specific purposes such as employment opportunities. An organization can build their social capital for a variety of purposes and can build social capital in a target group or community to progress their desired outcomes. And an institution can build social capital in its target community for a variety of reasons. And by institution, I'm really referring to those coordinating institutions such as government or larger national or transnational organizations. The application of social capital should be tailored to the specific level, whether it's targeting individuals, a group, or the community. Should be tailored to the desired outcomes and, of course, also to the context. And this means there's not just one way to apply social capital. The application for an individual is different than it would be for an organization or a community. And also, the types of actions that produce desired outcomes are also likely different, and therefore, the nature of any intervention is likely to be different. Social capital really is a tool for many different purposes. I want to touch briefly on how social capital has been conventionally used in most approaches until now. It really focuses on getting more people to make more and stronger relationships. So it might be activities for socialization. It might be more associations and more participation in those associations. Or it might be creating space and time for people to socialize, more tea rooms or game rooms, or allocating time for socialization, or whatever that might be. And these approaches aim to bring people together so that they can communicate in the hope that they will form meaningful relationships and develop shared predispositions that will support future positive social action. And these approaches are often quite effective because most people are reasonably good at forming meaningful relationships. So you get people together and they socialize, and that can help to produce social capital. However, this approach is a bit ad hoc because it doesn't take into account the different aspects of social capital, and it really just sticks people in a room and hopes that they'll produce meaningful relationships, which doesn't always happen. This webinar, I'll outline a more comprehensive approach to the application of social capital. So our approach to social capital connects with the deeper meaning of being social and what it means to engage in positive social action. It's based on the logic of capital and how investment can create a stock of future benefits and returns. It goes beyond narrow economic definitions to outline a general approach capable of incorporating the complexity of social capital in a way that is relatively easy to understand and apply in the real world. By connecting with the logic of capital and social action, we can draw on the extensive research across the broad spectrum of social capital literature. And social action is complex, but our approach provides a framework for understanding and applying the concept of social capital in purposeful and deliberate ways. So we created this approach by looking for what the various academic theories of social capital have in common. We asked, why are networks or norms or trust, for example, a form of capital? How and why do they represent a potential for future benefits and returns? And as stated earlier, we found that all the different meanings of social capital, at least those that are consistent with the logic of capital, represent just two key components. One is the opportunity or ability to act, and two is that inclination or predisposition to act. And connectedness and predispositions are central to our approach, and I'll expand on each of these next. As I mentioned, you may choose to use a different word to describe predispositions. Maybe inclinations or perhaps intentions fits your understanding better. So we went further than the meaning of social capital to explore how this potential for social action brings about future benefits and returns. And we connected with the extensive research on resources to incorporate the importance of the activation context in contributing to the desired outcomes, particularly the availability of other forms of capital. We explored the role of different levels of society in contributing to overall outcomes and how individuals, organizations, and coordinating institutions can all play important but different roles. Another feature of our approach is that it appreciates that social capital is not just one thing that does one thing. The potential for one type of social action does not necessarily mean there is also a potential for other types of social action. For example, people may work together to improve a school, but they may not trust each other enough to loan personal belongings. Another example is it's maybe possible for a group of people to cooperate in certain ways, but they may be also distrusting at the same time. And this means that different social capital, that is, different predispositions and connectedness, can produce a range of different outcomes. For example, a real estate agent will benefit from different patterns of connectedness and predispositions relative to a procurement officer, for example. So therefore, treating social capital as one thing reduces our ability to influence the desired outcomes. Another feature of our approach is that it appreciates that not everyone has access to social capital in the same ways, including different abilities and opportunities to build social capital and to use it for personal and collective outcomes. So I'll now provide some further explanation of what predispositions and connectedness are, since these are really quite central to our approach. So predispositions include a wide variety of reasons for social action. So it includes concepts such as social norms, goodwill, identity, all of the things that are listed on this slide. And they all reflect or influence the way people are inclined or likely to act in a given situation. Predispositions are important because they represent a stock of potential that makes certain actions more likely. For example, if people are predisposed to trust others, they will need to identify reasons during an interaction not to trust the other person. Therefore, trusting actions are most likely to occur. On the other hand, if there is an environment of distrust, then the opposite would be true. They would need to interpret reasons to overcome that predisposition to not trust others in order to engage in trusting activities. So while there's no guarantees that people will act in line with those predispositions, it certainly means that they're more likely to act in those kinds of ways, and that represents the potential nature of social capital. So we can see how processes, as a byproduct of other activities or perhaps as investment, can lead to the development of these predispositions that then shape the nature of future action. And as such, they're a vital part of the potential for social action. And different predispositions are important for different types of actions. If you want people to exchange freely, then trust is clearly important. If you want people to work collectively, then solidarity and shared goals are important. But what we find is that often all of these types of predispositions play some sort of a role to some degree in any particular context. But connectedness is the other key part, and people may be predisposed to positive social action, but if people are not connected by relationships or networks or membership in formal or informal organizations, then there are limited opportunities for social action and therefore limited social capital. If people are not connected, then there can only be unplanned or incidental outcomes, regardless of predispositions. For example, if you do not have very many friends, then you can't socialize with them, you can't call upon them, and this obviously limits the potential. People in your social grouping may be strongly predisposed to help, but if you don't know very many of them and you can't call upon them, and this clearly limits social capital outcomes to anything that's unplanned or incidental in nature. So imagine living in a community full of extremely generous, caring, and trustworthy people, but you don't know very many of them. The potential exists, but there's very few opportunities. And this highlights the importance of connectedness as one of the key components of social capital. You could walk around the street and knock on people's doors randomly and ask for help, but this would be inefficient and maybe even ineffective, because you wouldn't know who has the requisite skills to help you, or abilities, or even the predispositions to help you. So opportunities for social action come from connectedness. This is what it's all about, but also from knowing. And it's not enough just to know people. You need to know where to find them, how to contact them. You need to know about them. You need to know about their reputation. You need to know what they know, who they know. And all of this information, all of this knowing opens various opportunities for social action to occur. So it's not enough just to know people's names, clearly. We need to know a lot more about them if these opportunities are going to exist to engage in social action. And of course, don't forget about the activation context. As I mentioned earlier, many outcomes of social capital inform other forms of capital. And this means that social capital may be limited in the absence of these other forms of capital, particularly human and physical capital, depending on the desired outcomes. Social capital facilitates and lubricates. It helps to improve effectiveness and efficiency. It makes collective action more possible, but it cannot replace other forms of capital, assets, and resources. For example, a rural farming community may be well connected with strong relationships, but if no one possesses a tractor, then it cannot be shared or loaned. If information about support programs is not available, if no one knows it, it can't be shared. If no one knows an agricultural scientist, then a social introduction cannot be made that may help to improve practices. And there's many examples of how a lack of capital, assets, and resources, including social resources, can reduce the potential for social capital to produce desired outcomes. And of course, we need to be very mindful that not everyone has the same access to social capital. And every individual has different opportunities and abilities to create and utilize social capital based on a variety of different reasons. And we need to ensure we take this into account in any practical application of social capital. Social capital has both individual and collective properties. An individual can build and use their social capital. However, an individual has limited control and influence over the collective properties of social capital. So the opportunity and ability to engage in social action comes from connectedness, as we just identified. If people are not connected, then there is limited opportunity for social action, and they can't call upon others. The most obvious aspect of connectedness is social relationships. That is, individuals having mutual recognition for others. And this can include friends, family, colleagues, and acquaintances. We call this the individual properties of connectedness. But there are also collective properties of connectedness as well, which is the ways in which organizations shape and regulate connections between individuals due to membership and roles and procedures and so forth. So to put it simply, social groups such as clubs and teams and companies connect people to each other, which creates opportunities to engage in social action. Predispositions influence the potential for social action and the nature of social action when it occurs. Where these predispositions relate to specific people and relationships, we consider them to be the individual properties of social capital, and I call them the relational predispositions because they relate to relationships with specific people. People's actions, though, are also influenced by predispositions that are widely held by members of the collective and do not relate to specific individuals. So I call these the collective or the shared predispositions, which influence the nature of social action towards people within and external to the collective. This is important because this matrix represents 4 different avenues for the practical application of social capital. We can design practical applications to focus on one or more of these key areas. We can see how we can improve connectedness of individuals, improve social structures, shape the nature of relational predispositions, and of course, those shared predispositions as well. These are 4 different approaches or 4 different avenues for using social capital in practical applications. It's important also to see how different actors can have a different role to play in improving social capital and desired outcomes. Institutions, policymakers as well, largely responsible for shaping the enabling environment. Organizations are really the powerhouse for shaping shared predispositions, including connectedness, and making resources available. And the individuals are the powerhouse for making connections and building and maintaining goodwill and reputation, although they're often empowered by organizations and perhaps enabled by institutions. And the best results tend to occur when all levels can take an active role in building and using social capital. So we're now ready to put all this together into a logic schema for the application of social capital. So complex diagram, but if starting on the left side, we have the logic of capital, a process that creates a stock that then produces a flow of potential future benefits and returns. The source and the enabling environment acting through either a deliberate investment or as a byproduct of other activities. If we just simply go about our daily lives, we tend to build social capital as a byproduct of that. And this creates social capital, that capacity, that ability, that potential to be able to do something. It has individual and collective properties, and it has aspects of connectedness and predispositions, creating that 4-way matrix that we just discussed. This potential then facilitates the outcomes, the actions of individuals. This may be cooperation, information sharing, social introductions, and so forth. And that contributes towards the future benefits and returns, such as, say, innovation and creativity or resilience, but also there can be externalities or other downsides or negative consequences that may also occur. On the right-hand side, we have the primary change agents. We mentioned how institutions and policymakers really are largely responsible for shaping the nature of the enabling environment, individuals playing a crucial role in the individual properties, and organizations, particularly in the collective properties, as well as the activation context. And on the far right side, I've listed some of the key aspects of each of those different areas of connectedness and predispositions, as well, of course, the activation context. So this, as I mentioned, represents 6 broad areas for the application of social capital. And I've listed them here on the right-hand side. We have focusing on building and strengthening individual relationships, developing and improving relational predispositions, establishing and strengthening social structures, improving shared predispositions, improvements to the activation context, and changes to the enabling environment. And if we look at where this actually fits within the logic schema, it actually relates to the source and to the outcomes, because approaches in 1 to 4 are processes that create and shape social capital. They may be changes to existing activities, or they may be new and purposeful activities designed to create social capital. So as such, they're processes. They fit up here under source. And individuals and organizations engaging in these actions can influence the nature of social capital. So I've just redirected these lines to show how actions of individuals and organizations can create a process that can influence the nature of social capital. It's perhaps a technicality, but that's the logic of how social capital works. Of course, approaches that relate to 5, the activation context, aim to improve social capital outcomes by making forms of capital and resources more available and accessible. This is not an example of building social capital, because, say, for example, you provide information about to community healthcare workers that can be disseminated to the community. That's not building social capital. It just improves the potential for that information to be disseminated, and therefore it's improving the outcomes that can occur. The predispositions and the connectedness can then more readily mobilize that capital, that information. Approaches that relate to the enabling environment, number 6, shape that enabling environment and influence the nature and effectiveness of opportunities 1 through 4. For example, changes to the built environment, such as creating a social space, is not building social capital directly, but it enables and facilitates its creation. Another example is the nature of laws and their fair enforcement, which again does not directly build social capital, but it shapes the creation of social capital through influencing the nature and potential of social action. So then we've got a range of different opportunities and ways in which we might apply social capital. First of all, we'd need to do some form of evaluation, and I'll talk about each of these fairly briefly. We can design activities or modify existing activities. We can build social capital in a general sense or for a specific purpose. We can focus on individual properties, and there's a couple of key opportunities here: improving an understanding of social capital and strengthening capacity to improve social capital. And then we have each of those 6 opportunities that were identified previously, and I'll talk about each of these fairly briefly. So regardless of your application of social capital, you'll have to conduct some form of evaluation of the social environment to understand what needs to be done. And this could be an informal evaluation that you conduct yourself by simply thinking through each aspect of social capital in your context, or it may be a more formal evaluation process. But regardless of the scope of the evaluation, you can use the social capital framework to structure that evaluation. Of course, the exact questions you evaluate will depend on the context. And you'll also need to think about other considerations, such as available resources, the extent of decision-making authority, and perhaps the extent of cooperation from other stakeholders. I find it's very useful to structure the evaluation similar to a SWOT analysis in strategic planning. A SWOT analysis helps us to build on strengths, minimize weaknesses, seize opportunities, and counteract threats. So an evaluation of social capital can illuminate multiple ways to improve social capital and its desired outcomes. The process for these formalized evaluations may take the form of an impact assessment. So this is an assessment of a specific activity or project to assess its impact on social capital, which of course then provides a range of opportunities for changes and or evaluation of the particular activity or project. There's the SWOT analysis style, which I just mentioned before, which can be a very effective formal evaluation process. Or we may do an accessibility assessment, which is to assess how accessible social capital and its use is for different members of a particular community or group. That often will be incorporated into one of the other two formal assessment processes, or it could be done separately. And also an opportunity appraisal to review the key opportunities to build and use social capital more effectively for a particular context. So I'll just move through each of these lists. Because social capital is built and in fact damaged as a byproduct of everyday activities, it's an important application of social capital is to inform the design and implementation of any activity that involves social action, which of course is just about everything. And any activity or project can be evaluated to identify how it could be modified, often in small ways, to improve social capital development and use. So relevant programs here may be an assessment where we assess a project or an activity for its how sensitive it is to social capital and therefore how it could be improved. Or we might actually conduct a workshop to help, say, project managers to design activities that are more sensitive to social capital and therefore to improve the desired outcomes. This is a really valuable way to apply social capital in practice. We can build social capital in a general sense. I think this is something that we very often do because we don't have a specific purpose in mind, or we don't want to intervene at such a detailed level. To do this, we'll use the framework. So we can work our way through each of these different aspects, focusing on each of these different opportunities, and we'll naturally identify that we want to improve connectedness. These just fall straight out of that framework, and they're pretty readily identified. Create and strengthen predispositions, build trust. These things are in the framework and they'll become very obvious to us as soon as we start looking at them if we're looking to build social capital in a general sense. But often we want to build social capital for a very specific purpose. And because social capital can influence a range of different outcomes, if you do have a specific purpose, then it's useful to start by defining very clearly the desired outcomes and then work backwards to identify the actions that bring about those outcomes. And again, we would use the framework to identify each of the things we'd do at each step. Now, the four-way matrix identified before as key areas for building and applying social capital. And I'll talk just very briefly about each of these four areas just to provide a little more detail. Of course, this is quite complex, and covering it off in one short webinar has to be really just in summary form. So starting in the social relationships area, the individual properties of connectedness are all about building, strengthening, and maintaining individual social relationships. So this means people having more relationships with more people from different backgrounds and positions in society, knowing more about their connections and having more opportunities for connection through memberships and roles that create opportunities for interactions. And we can think about how our application of social capital can improve these particular aspects. Relational predispositions, this is really about reputation, including reputation for trustworthiness and reciprocity. But it also includes goodwill and obligations and various interpersonal norms that develop over time and relate to specific relationships. It also includes feelings of empathy and regard and perhaps solidarity towards other individuals. And strong social capital involves the development of a positive reputation and various other aspects listed. So individuals may engage in programs such as social capital coaching to help them to improve these relational predispositions. They're developed really through social interaction and communication. Spending time with people and observing them develops these understandings that shape the nature of future action towards and related to them. As such, really, there's no substitute for spending time in social interaction, particularly when it involves communication that seeks to reach consensus and consent. Now, people can be left to socialize, or socialization can be facilitated or directed to some extent. Many organizational activities may seek to build or improve relational predispositions and may undertake activities to encourage social interaction, while at the same time attempting to redirect the nature of that interaction towards positive outcomes. Team building exercises is a perfect example, or trust building exercises where people get together, they socially interact, but it's directed, it's facilitated towards particular types of ends. Moving on to collective aspects of connectedness. Establishing and strengthening social structures is a common approach to building social capital, because social structures can influence individual connectedness and therefore the nature of individual predispositions, which in turn can contribute to the development of the collective predispositions. And it's important to recognize that these structures can have those positive impacts, but they need organizational capacity. They need effective leadership, they need funding. Otherwise, these structures perhaps can be ineffective or even damaging to social capital. And the collective properties of predispositions, every group, whether it's a team or a club or a company, develops shared predispositions specific to that group. And the shared predispositions may not be held equally by all members of the group and apply equally, so they can be somewhat intangible. However, they powerfully shape the nature of action and the nature of social relationships within and external to that group. So applications that focus on the predispositions may aim to strengthen or change them to facilitate more positive action and to align with specific actions that contribute towards desired outcomes. So, for example, we may assess the nature of social trust and evaluate any signals that may undermine trust and the source of untrustworthy beliefs and actions. An evaluation of the signals of norms, for example. We may look for how clear the communication is about various expectations or obligations that help to form those norms, how clear and consistent they are, and how they align with individual beliefs within that social grouping. We may aim to develop shared goals, and that's pretty easy, really. You get people together, you talk about what's important and what we want to collectively achieve. We could develop shared language and codes and narratives and social identity and so forth. And we can also identify and address any unproductive stereotypes or prejudices that may be related to specific individuals. So as I mentioned, this is a really big opportunity to improve social capital, is through helping individuals to understand and value the importance of social capital. Because when they do, they tend to change their actions to build and use social capital more and more effectively. Of course, for most people, social capital is a critical resource for personal and professional well-being. However, few people are aware of just how important it is and how many benefits and opportunities they have received in their lives because of social capital. When people reconnect with its importance and value, they're more likely to spend more time and effort getting to know people. They may listen more attentively and make more effort to remember things about others. And they're probably less likely to betray trust, to violate norms, to exploit others, and so forth, because they value social capital. They reconnect with its importance. So an improved understanding can be a benefit at any level of an organization or society. When leaders and policymakers gain a better understanding of social capital, they're more likely to prioritize social capital building, and even in subtle or informal ways in decisions they make and in policy. So relevant programs here may be programs like social capital literacy, There's some fantastic programs being run by social capital builders in the United States that are focused on this. It might be social capital training and workshops, perhaps, that we might engage in, or perhaps social capital appraisal or inventory. But with all of this, if I have one thing to say about it, is that we need to be very careful to balance individual interests about collective interests. If people learn about social capital and they're all focused on exactly what they can get for themselves, then it's clearly going to undermine the effectiveness of collective interests and ultimately their social capital. We can also strengthen the capacity of individuals so they can improve their own social capital. Social capital relies on individual competencies such as effective communication skills. For some people, they seem to effortlessly build strong and effective relationships. They're great communicators, they have great emotional intelligence and empathy, and they can easily build rapport and goodwill, remember people's names easily. But for other people, they might want to make more and stronger relationships, but they really just lack the skills required to do it effectively. But fortunately, many of the skills and abilities that help build strong social relationships can be learned. People can participate in effective communication training, and they can undertake empathy and emotional intelligence training. And research suggests that these skills can be acquired, and it can make a substantial difference in developing meaningful relationships. So as I discussed, just because social capital exists does not mean it can be effectively activated to produce the desired outcomes. There may not be a strong potential for social action, but if there are barriers to its activation, such as no appropriate physical space or a lack of time or inadequate technologies or insufficient resources, then the potential for social capital to produce outcomes is clearly diminished. So practical applications then can, very obvious really, ensure that these required resources are available to those who need them. Develop systems to connect resources and to mobilize them, and perhaps to evaluate the knowledge of the available resources and how to assess them. These are just a few simple ideas. Of course, in your particular context, there might be other things that are relevant and appropriate for you to do. The enabling environment is complex, interplay of various elements that collectively enable or inhibit the development of social capital. It relates to how institutions enable and constrain people's actions, especially those actions that relate to the formation of social capital, such as social interaction. For example, the availability of adequate collaboration infrastructure, including space and time and means for social interaction. It could include institutional incentives or support for those types of actions, or in fact, disincentives or barriers for activities that create social capital. Quite often, institutions have all of these different barriers or in fact incentives, and they don't actually realize what sort of impact it has on social capital formation and use. And it can even relate to laws and their enforcement and the perceptions of fairness, especially those laws that relate to social interaction and exchange. So by way of summary, there's lots of different areas for the practical application of social capital. Talked about the evaluation and how important that is, as well as many of the key opportunities for how we might go about using the concept in different practical applications. Social capital clearly is an important conceptual tool with significant potential to improve outcomes anywhere people work together and where cooperation and positive social action are beneficial, which of course is just about everything that humans do. The concept of social capital connects social processes with the outcomes that they produce, and therefore it allows us to be purposeful and deliberate in our activities. It provides a framework for understanding why and how people collaborate, interact positively and work together. And it allows people, teams, organizations, projects, and communities to be more effective, productive, and successful. The social capital framework can be used to systematically design practical applications. This webinar has identified and discussed various areas for the practical application of social capital, and I've outlined a general approach and the key ways in which the concept can be applied in practice. I've identified many of the common programs that can be implemented, However, I've not provided a specific blueprint since social capital is complex and, of course, context dependent. But I think we can see that the framework that I've outlined in this webinar can be used to design, implement, and evaluate a wide variety of different applications of social capital. So over to questions and discussion. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat. You can also raise your hand. That's under the reactions button in Zoom. And then you'll be able to unmute yourself and ask your question. I'll just scroll back through the chat, see if there was any questions posted in there. Otherwise, yeah, please feel free to ask your questions. I can't see anything in the chat unless I've missed something. One's just come up from Bernardo. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question if you would like, Bernardo.
Okay, I tried to do my best. Thank you, Tristan. Excellent presentation. I wanted to ask some general questions, and maybe afterwards some specific, if I may.
Yeah, sure.
How would you relate this social capital theory to other theories like new institutional economics, cluster economics, geographical economics, system theory, Luhmann? Which are the similarities, boundaries, and methodological differences? If you can elaborate. If it's too broad, please tell me, and I have patience for the future. Thank you.
It certainly is a broad question. I think that what I've done is I've built this logic schema, or this framework, if you like, from a wide variety of different sources, from across virtually all of the different theoretical areas of social capital, as well as from a lot of areas outside of that. I've been talking and working with Lyndon Robertson, who is really an economist on this for several years, and he has contributed a lot of really fantastic ideas that's helped to shape the nature of this application. And I'm sure many of those ideas come from institutional economics or behavioral economics as well. I am actually a geographer, so I've studied economic geography, so some of that comes in there, and I'm very interested in the literature, particularly coming out of the built environment and how urban planning and even design and architecture can shape the nature of spaces that play an important role in the enabling environment, in facilitating the nature of social interaction. So I think we could dig into each of those theories and see how they fit. Of course, this is a very broad framework that provides a huge range of opportunities for us to be able to explore how we can apply social capital in practice in different kinds of areas. Not sure how I've answered your question there, Bernardo, but feel free to respond.
Thank you. That was okay. I continue looking for differences and similarities, because I'm researching on new institutional economics, and I see a lot of similarities with social capital. They are, I don't know, related a lot. So I build up on on this framework.
Yeah, thank you, Bernardo. I think as well, for those people who are in academia, I've deliberately tried to make this as accessible for practical applications as possible. But in terms of theory, I think everyone will see a lot of alignment with the distinction between structural and, say, cognitive dimensions of social capital as aligning very closely with connectedness and predispositions, respectively. So there's extensive work here that could be drawn on and relates back to theories of structural and relational embeddedness, for example, that is really providing the foundation for this framework overall, if we wanted to get into the theory and academic side of it.
Thank you, Tristan.
Thank you. Okay, Oleg has your hand up. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Tristan, may I ask a question?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Tristan, for the informative report. I would like to clarify some points. The metaphors of glue and grease are often found in research on social capital. In my opinion, glue fixes the state, while social relations are mobile, dynamic. What's your opinion on this issue? Can you suggest any metaphor for the concept of social capital that would best reflect its essence and content?
Well, I think the glue part is that connectedness part. It brings people together, both in the sense that it provides those opportunities and abilities to be able to engage in social action. But the glue also suggests that we have solidarity, that we have those shared predispositions that bind people together with commitments, with expectations, with norms, where behaviors that perhaps are outside of those expectations may be punished by exclusion or by social sanctions. So glue to me is really focused on the real nature of what social capital is, whereas the claims about being a lubricant is more about what social capital can do, because it can facilitate, it can enable, it can mobilize, and therefore it talks a lot more about what social capital can do. But I suspect I haven't quite answered your question, so could you clarify exactly what you're asking?
Well, thanks a lot. It was very interesting to hear your report. It was fruitful, and thanks a lot.
Thank you, Oleg. All right, anybody else have any questions? Have I missed anything in the chat? Otherwise, feel free to post something in the chat. If you'd like me to read out your question, please feel free to just mention that in the chat and I can read your question out and answer it. Otherwise, you're welcome to put up your hand, and when I call upon you, you can unmute yourself. Mike, would you like to ask your question, or I'll happily read it out?
Go ahead and read it out. It's more of it's just a question about the availability of the schema, the logic schema that is on the screen. I just don't remember that being so well developed in previous presentations, and I'd like to have a copy available if this presentation is going to be available in some form going forward. I'd like to print it out.
Yeah, sure thing. So this webinar will be on YouTube and available for anyone to access at any time. And I'm currently in the final stages of putting together a practical guide document that includes this and is substantially more significant and substantive than this as well. And I anticipate that'll be available in the next few weeks. In terms of this being more well developed than what I've presented previously, I've kind of thrown the shackles off here. This is the practical application. This isn't research. I don't feel bound by narrow academic standards of what we can do and say. So this is an approach that brings everything together without having to incorporate that kind of conceptual theory. What am I trying to say? I've gone significantly beyond the literature here. I think you'll agree. And I've felt empowered to be able to do that because this applies to the practical applications rather than to narrow academic research applications. I wouldn't advise PhD researchers, example, to necessarily take this on because there just isn't sufficient background for this in the literature. This goes significantly beyond the literature, if you like.
Of course, you know my orientation towards the practical, so I mean, it would have appeal to me. So,
yeah, and I think everyone can, appreciate the logic here. Like this is clearly very grounded on the theory and the literature, and it just interprets in a way I think that is very useful for practical applications. you know, when I included that quote from Bob Putnam. I actually discovered that the hard way. You know, I went from all of the different sort of, you know, lists of things that exist in the literature to discover that there were these two things. But Bob Putnam had that wonderful sentence that very perfectly illustrates that that's the case. And I think it's incredibly logical that that is the case. And so this then provides that sort of framework and structure to be able to, you know, not to be very purposeful, to not ignore the opportunities and to not ignore the predispositions, to acknowledge that both are important, and even the individual and collective properties that, you know, we can see how we can make these individual relationships, but clearly we're also influenced by what happens at a collective level as well. And so therefore we can be really systematic about how we can understand what's happening. And I think that's the value of this approach.
Well, you've demonstrated, more than demonstrated, a level of mastery in my humble disposition. So no further justifications necessary. I mean, thank you. I think it's well done.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mike. Next question is from Tatiana. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Tristan. This has been wonderful. I think I first got introduced to you when I started my dissertation. You have definitely helped me along the way. So now that I'm done with that process, I'm looking to help individuals who are historically disadvantaged, you know, by SES status and namely concentrated poverty. I would like to help them develop their capacity for social capital generation. However, when you engage in those activities, it seems to me that you would have to have an instrument that measures your impact. So that's really what my question is getting into. Thank you for the practical applications, but how do we, as brokers of social capital, measure our impact when we engage in these applications?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I didn't have time to talk about that in the webinar, but one of the benefits of when we're applying social capital to a particular context, one of the benefits of working backwards and clearly identifying what the outcome we're looking for, what actions contribute towards that outcome, and therefore what forms of connectedness and predispositions shape the nature of those actions specifically, which is clearly going to provide the biggest impact for the outcomes that we're interested in. By going through that process, we're identifying the key things we need to measure. And because we've identified them, we can then measure them, and then we know what our impact is. And it's a very different approach than a lot of the conventional approaches to social capital, which just simply say, we need more social relationships. And so when you do that, sure, you can measure whether or not there are more social relationships, but you can't measure anything else because you haven't identified anything else that is important to producing the outcomes you're interested in. And so I call this often, like in an organizational setting, I call this participatory social capital evaluation, because we're actually getting together as a group and we're asking each other, well, what's important to you? You know, like, well, you know, how do you benefit from social actions in your life, in your work? And then by identifying those things, then everybody becomes more aware of their importance, and then they then naturally change their actions. But we also then have something to measure as well, because they've identified exactly what it is we should be measuring in the process. So in your context, it sounds like it's a little different because it's not within an organization, it's within a community or a particular stakeholder group, particular types of individuals. But you probably still, whether you do it yourself or you work with them to be able to identify it, you probably can still do a very similar kind of thing, where you can identify the types of actions, types of connections, types of predispositions then that they're going to lead to the kinds of outcomes that you're looking for, and then you know exactly what to measure.
Thank you.
What I just said sounds really easy. Of course it's not. You know, of course, the framework can be a really great guide for this, but it still isn't easy because you need to understand your context, which I'm sure you do. You also need to understand the social capital and how each of these different components can play an important role in that part, in your outcomes. So what we can do is, dig into, what reputation is, how that really works in that particular context. How does regard work? How does empathy play within that particular context, and really dig in and explore the role that each of these different components may have in bringing about the outcomes that you have. It's not quite as easy as I've made out, but the framework's here, I think, to be able to really dig into it. All right, who's next? I think we have a question from Diana. Or no, just saying that you'd be grateful for the complete document when it's available. I'll circulate the information about that as soon as it is. So if you're subscribed on the mailing list, then you'll certainly get that notification. Otherwise, get in touch with me in a couple of weeks. Bernardo asks about bridging function of social capital. If you're talking about the distinction between bonding and bridging, I've included that here under network configuration. It clearly is very important that, if you're connected to a lot of individuals who are really just the same as you, who move in similar social circles, then it reduces the opportunities and the abilities to connect and engage with different forms of other capital and resources. So I've touched on that in the practical guide, but I don't extensively explore that. But it certainly is a part of that network configuration, which clearly plays a really important role. What else do we have? Next one. Raina, did you want to unmute yourself and ask a question? Or more, or is it just a comment? I'm not sure Raina's actually here anymore. All right, doesn't seem like we have any more questions. Anybody else want to ask any questions or have any comments, or do you seek any clarification about this? Feel free to post in the chat, or you can put up your hand. Oh, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, hey, thank you. And I've been eagerly waiting for this ever since I heard you say that this was something that you were going to be doing. So first of all, thank you. I'm curious to know, maybe you got some stories of people who are being explicit about social capital and how that's resulting in how does mindful approaches to social capital and organizational work manifest itself in some stories that you might be able to tell us?
Many. I mean, what sort of organizational work? Do you mean like internally, similar to organizational culture, where we're looking to improve?
Let's say people doing like pro-social work in particular, positive like neighborhood level work would be a nice one if you have an example like that.
Neighborhood level one. Trying to think off the top of my head without talking about any clients that probably wouldn't want me necessarily to talk about.
Oh yeah, I mean,
projects.
another one would be just ones that you're excited about too. Tristan, is the other thing. If you're just like, there's some groups that you're just like, wow, I love what they're doing, and they're being thoughtful about their approach with social capital. I'd love to hear.
Yeah, nothing comes to mind immediately that I think that I can share. I mean, I think there's so many groups out there that are embracing this concept now, and that they're seeing how, especially volunteer-run organizations are seeing how, of course, their volunteers are their greatest asset, and they can use this framework to understand how the ways in which they're connected and the ways in which they develop these collective predispositions really shape their volunteerism, the ways in which they engage with that volunteer-based organization. And I think it highlights how so many volunteers get burnt out and just disengage because particularly the shared predispositions that end up developing in organizations can be quite unproductive. So I think I'm particularly excited about that. If you're talking about community spaces, Yeah, I mean, there's so many examples. I probably need to dig into like some particular interest areas. That's one of the challenges with social capital is it can be applied to so many areas. I was working on last week poverty alleviation, but then can be working in community development. Next week, and then might be working in strengthening organizations to improve their particular performance internally, and then working on a project sort of context. So social capital has such broad applications. Fantastic, but it can be very complex.
I'm appreciating the fact that when you go there, you have this in the background, and when people are sharing how they approach things, you can like see where it fits on this. Probably, I only say that because I look at like one of our aphorisms is if it's not fun, we're effed, and but we can see how that fits right in this shared predispositions idea. If we really embody this, then we're having fun, and these are work parties, and we're having fun while we're doing what we're doing as much as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the things that consistently come up for me in the work that I do is things like shared language, perhaps, that it might seem like a really minor thing, but it can be a real barrier for people to be able to engage in a particular community where they don't feel like they know the lingo, or there's technical terms they don't understand, and it creates a bit of embarrassment or uncertainty, or there's so many ways in which the narratives and the codes in a social grouping can be really inclusive and can create a really strong sense of belonging within the grouping, but can also then be a significant barrier for people who are going to join, or perhaps are outside of that social grouping. So I think, what fascinates me so much about this is that we can dig into so many of these different areas, and it can illuminate and highlight so significantly how it can impact our projects, our activities.
Yeah, thank you. I have other questions, but let's hear from some other folks here.
Yeah, sure. We might come back to you because there are not a lot of questions coming up at the moment, and we still have about 10 more minutes. Bernardo posted another question. Would you like to unmute yourself, Bernardo, and ask that?
Thank you very much, Tristan, for your nice presentation. I think you did not discuss in your discussion about bonding, bridging, and linking social capital patterns.
That is correct. I did not mention it at all. As I mentioned to Bernardo, bonding, bridging, linking really fits under network configuration for me. It's the way in which people are connected to different individuals in different social positions within society. So, as you know, of course, bonding social capital is about those connections with people who are in similar social circles to you, whereas bridging, of course, being connections with people who are in different positions within society or in different social circles. And so to me, it is important. It can play a really significant role here under the nature of connectedness, but it is only one very small part of what I see as being the overall framework for how we may be able to apply the concept of social capital. I know that bridging, bonding, that distinction is really popular, and particularly in the academic literature, and it intuitively makes a lot of sense for practical applications. But to me, it is only one very small part, as I mentioned. It can illuminate certain things, but it doesn't tell us very much about really any of the rest of it. So Bernardo, your question about definition of positive social capital. What do you mean by that?
No, I mean, if there is a definition for each society, if each society can define what is positive social capital, because does it have universal validity, the definition of social capital, or is it valid for a group or for a region or for a country, or I don't know, for similar people around the world? I don't know. Maybe you can elaborate. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the question of positive and negative outcomes of social capital is a really complex one, because clearly we can't define social capital in a way that only produces positive outcomes. Otherwise, we end up with a paradox, because the same processes, the same things that are positive, may also be negative in different contexts. And so if it has to be positive, then the same thing simply ceases to be social capital when it produces negative outcomes. It's paradoxical. It doesn't make any sense. And if we look at the other forms of capital, say physical capital and perhaps even human capital, we can see that the nature of the capital is separate from how it is used or the outcomes that it produces. So, for example, a hammer, an item of physical capital, can be used to build a house, a positive and productive outcome, but it can also be used as a weapon, which I think we'd agree is a negative outcome. Information about chemistry, human capital, knowledge of chemistry can be used to produce fantastic things in business and can be used to produce a profit, but it can also be used to make a bomb. It can also be used to make a poison, perhaps. So we can see how the capital really needs to be separated from the outcomes that it produces. And if we focus on social capital being that potential for social action, the way in which we're connected and we have predispositions that enable, that facilitate social action to occur. And what I mean by social action is simply action that is oriented towards other people. And so we're not saying what the nature of that action is. And so it opens the possibility for there to be positive outcomes, of course, because that's why we're interested in it, but also acknowledging that there can be negative outcomes as well. And often simultaneously. I mentioned before about a group that has really strong solidarity and tight bonds can exclude others. So while there can be positive benefits for the group, there can be simultaneously some negative downsides as well at the same time. And so I think it's really important, if we're going to progress this concept and make it more useful, we need to find a way to be able to understand, this is really a fundamental characteristic of capital, that it's separate from what it does. The question of cultural applicability comes up quite often. And I think that what you'll see here is that I've made no specific reference to cultural traits. All cultures have relationships. All cultures have reputation, have the development of goodwill, empathy. All of the things here, I think, are relevant to every cultural context. But of course, every cultural context is different. So we can use this framework anywhere, but we have to be culturally sensitive to what's going on there. But not just culturally sensitive. We need to be sensitive to the law and institutions and history and religion and so many other things about the context within which we're applying social capital. But all of that can be done still within the context of this framework. Not sure if I've answered your question. Feel free to ask a follow-up, Bernardo.
Excellent, excellent answer. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? We have, well, still about 10 minutes if we need that much time. Feel free to post in the chat, or you can raise your hand and ask a question. Doesn't sound like we have any more questions unless someone's furiously typing. So I'll stop the recording in just a moment. You're welcome to stay on the session a little longer if you'd like for some more informal discussion. I'd like to encourage everyone here to get involved with the association. This webinar is hosted by the International Social Capital Association, so I'll post a link to some information in the chat now about that. And the association also has a community space now as well, where you can get together and share ideas, share resources, identify opportunities for collaboration and so forth. That's a fantastic opportunity. It's free and available to members and non-members alike. So feel free to get involved in that. And we have a fantastic series of webinars coming up as well in the coming months. So check the association website for further details about those. So I'll stop the recording now. As I mentioned, feel free to stay online a little longer if you would like for